Jada Carter stands drenched in sweat outside Elwood's crumbling courthouse, clutching a blood-streaked deed as sirens wail in the distance. Moments ago, she and her twin, Jessa, won their case, or so they thought. Judge Raymond Voss had sneered, "You don't belong here," only to freeze when their US Army Ranger credentials surfaced. Now victory feels hollow. Their farm burns on the horizon, torched by unseen hands. What started as a land dispute has ignited a war they never saw coming, one that will scar their future forever. How did it spiral this far? Before we dive into this wild tale, let me know where you're watching from. And if you stand for justice against all odds, hit that like button and subscribe for more gripping stories like this one. Jada Carter wiped the sweat from her brow as she stepped off the rusted Greyhound bus, the sticky Georgia heat wrapping around her like a wet blanket. It was 2 weeks before that chaotic courthouse scene, and she and her twin sister, Jessa, had just rolled into Elwood, a sleepy southern town where the air buzzed with cicadas and unspoken rules. Their grandfather's 50-acre farm waited on the outskirts, a patchwork of red clay and wild grass he'd left them when he passed 6 months ago. Jada adjusted the strap of her duffel bag, her braided hair pulled tight into a bun, and glanced at Jessa, who stood beside her, mirroring her stance. They were identical down to the last coil, tall and lean with skin like polished ebony, dressed in faded jeans and tank tops from a life spent moving. The bus station sat at the edge of town, a cracked concrete slab beside a gas station where 2 old men in overalls squinted at them from rocking chairs, their murmurs sharp with curiosity. Jada caught the word outsiders slicing through the humid stillness, and her jaw tightened. She'd expected a homecoming, not a cold stare, but this was Elwood, a place where time seemed to crawl and old ways clung like moss. Jessa nudged her, nodding toward the county clerk's office across the street, a squat brick building with peeling paint and a Confederate flag sticker fading on the door. They'd come to file the deed to make the farm legally theirs before anyone could contest it. Jada took a deep breath, tasting dust and diesel, and led the way, her boots thudding against the pavement. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of mildew and cheap cologne. A ceiling fan creaked overhead, barely stirring the heat, and behind the counter stood Clarence Tate, a wiry man with a buzz cut and a grin that didn't reach his pale blue eyes. His badge read county clerk, but his posture screamed gatekeeper. Jada slid the deed across the chipped wooden counter, her voice steady. "We're here to register this. It's our grandfather's farm, passed to us in his will." Tate barely glanced at the paper, his fingers drumming a lazy rhythm as he leaned back in his chair. "Y'all sure this is yours?" he drawled, his tone dripping with doubt. "Folks round here don't recall no Carters owning land that big. Maybe y'all should stick to the city where you fit." Jada's pulse quickened, but she kept her face stone cold, a trick she'd learned in tougher spots than this. She'd faced drill sergeants who'd screamed worse, and she wasn't about to flinch now. "It's ours," she said, her words clipped. "Check the will, it's all there." Tate's grin widened, showing yellowed teeth, and he flipped through a stack of papers with exaggerated slowness, muttering about missing files and proper channels. Jessa stepped forward, her voice calm but firm, pulling a second copy of the deed from her bag. "Here's a duplicate," she said, laying it down with a soft thud. "We don't play games. File it." Tate's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing as he realized they'd outmaneuvered his little stall tactic. He snatched the document, stamped it with a grunt and shoved it into a drawer, but not before muttering under his breath, "Ain't gonna last long here anyway." Jada caught the jab, her fists balling at her sides, but Jessa's hand on her arm kept her grounded. They'd won this round, small as it was, and walked out with the farm legally theirs, at least on paper. The sun dipped low as they checked into the Pineview Motel, a rundown strip of rooms off Highway 6 with flickering neon letters spelling vacancy. Their room smelled of stale smoke and mothballs, the carpet stained with years of neglect, but it was a base, a place to plan. Jada dropped her bag on one of the sagging beds, peering out the window at the darkening fields beyond. "They don't want us here," she said, her voice low. Jessa sat cross-legged on the other bed, unpacking a laptop to double-check their legal docs. "Let 'em stare," she replied, her tone cool. "We've got the deed. That's what matters." They'd spent years apart from Elwood, first at college up north, then in the army. But this land was their root, their grandfather's sweat baked into every acre. He'd been a quiet man, a farmer who'd outlasted droughts and neighbors' sneers, and they weren't about to let his legacy slip away. Night fell heavy, the sky a blanket of stars pierced by the occasional hum of a passing truck. Jada was drifting off, the mattress creaking beneath her, when a sharp crack split the silence. Glass shattered, spraying across the floor, and she bolted upright, heart slamming against her ribs. Jessa was already on her feet, crouched low, her eyes scanning the dark. Her jagged rock lay in the wreckage of the window, a crumpled note taped to it. Jada snatched it up, her fingers trembling as she unfolded the paper. Scrawled in black ink were 3 words: "Leave or burn." The threat hung in the air like smoke, raw and real. Jessa grabbed her phone, snapping a photo of the mess, her jaw set. "They're scared," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline. "Means we're a threat." Jada nodded, crumpling the note in her fist. She wanted to march out and confront whoever'd thrown it, but Jessa's look stopped her. They weren't kids anymore, impulsive and reckless. They'd learned patience, strategy, the hard way. The next morning, they reported the rock to the motel clerk, a bored teenager who shrugged and mumbled about pranks. Jada didn't buy it, but she let it slide, focusing on the farm instead. They rented a beat-up pickup from a gas station and drove out to see it, the road winding past, cotton fields and rusted silos. The farm sprawled across a gentle hill, 50 acres of tangled weeds and good soil. The old barn leaning slightly but still proud. Jada felt a pang of pride, imagining her grandfather's hands planting those fields. Jessa climbed out, shielding, her eyes against the sun, and pointed to a faded no trespassing sign. "This is ours," she said, a rare smile breaking through. They spent the day walking the land, mapping it in their heads, dreaming of crops and repairs. For a moment, it felt like they'd won something real, something solid. But that illusion cracked fast. 3 days later, a letter arrived at the motel, stamped with the Elwood Zoning Board's seal. Jada tore it open, her stomach sinking as she read. The board claimed the farm's boundaries violated new zoning lines, drawn up just last month, and summoned them to court in a week. "This ain't random," Jada said, tossing the paper to Jessa. Her sister scanned it, her brow furrowing. "They're testing us," she replied, folding it neatly. "Tate's behind this, bet anything." Jada paced the room, her boots scuffing the carpet. The rock, the stairs, now this. It was a pattern, a noose tightening. She thought of their grandfather, how he'd fought off land grabs in his day and felt a fire kindle in her chest. "They think we'll run," she said, stopping to face Jessa. "They don't know us." Jessa nodded, her eyes sharp with the same resolve. They'd faced worse than small-town bigots, sandstorms and gunfire in places Elwood couldn't imagine. This was just the opening shot, a jab to see if they'd flinch. Jada pulled out her phone, searching for zoning laws, while Jessa dug into their grandfather's old records, hunting for proof of the farm's history. They worked late, the motel room lit by the glow of screens and a single buzzing lamp, piecing together a defense. The air outside thickened with evening mist, crickets chirping in a relentless chorus, but inside the twins were locked in, focused. They didn't notice the pickup truck idling across the street, its headlights off, or the figure watching from the shadows, a match flaring briefly in the dark. By dawn, they had a stack of papers, tax receipts from 1972, a surveyor's, map from 85, all showing the farm's 50 acres unchanged. Jada rubbed her eyes, exhaustion tugging at her, but she felt a flicker of hope. "This'll hold in court," she said, tapping the pile. Jessa leaned back, stretching her arms. "If they play fair," she added, her voice dry. They both knew fair wasn't Elwood's game, not with Tate smirking behind his counter, not with those whispers trailing them everywhere. The rock threw. The window wasn't a prank. It was a promise, and the zoning summons was the next move in a fight they hadn't asked for. As the week ticked down, the town's mood shifted. White locals at the diner stared longer, their forks pausing mid-bite when Jada and Jessa walked in for coffee. A cashier at the hardware store forgot to ring up their nails and wire, muttering about good land going to waste. Jada kept her cool, paying cash and walking out, but the weight grew heavier. Jessa noticed it too, the way folks clammed up when they passed, the way outsiders became a hiss on the wind. They weren't just claiming a farm, they were stepping on a nerve, and Elwood didn't like it. The night before the hearing, Jada lay awake, staring at the patched-up window, the note's words looping in her mind. Leave or burn. She glanced at Jessa, asleep but restless, and clenched her fists. They weren't leaving, not now, not ever. But as the courthouse loomed in her thoughts, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that the real fire was yet to come. Jessa Carter adjusted her blazer, the fabric sticking to her skin in the stifling heat of Elwood's courthouse. It was a week after that rock shattered their motel window, and now she stood beside Jada in a room that reeked of old wood and older grudges. The courtroom was a relic, its walls lined with warped panels, the ceiling stained yellow from decades of tobacco smoke. A single fan spun lazily overhead, doing nothing to cut the humidity that made every breath feel like a gulp. Jessa's eyes flicked to the gallery, a sparse crowd of locals with folded arms and pinched faces, their whispers buzzing like flies. She and Jada had come prepared, a thick folder of documents tucked under Jada's arm, proof that their grandfather's 50-acre farm had been zoned as agricultural land since 1972. But this wasn't about facts, not really. This was about the summons from the zoning board, a flimsy claim that the farm's boundaries crossed some new, invisible line drawn up to push them out. And presiding over it all was Judge Raymond Voss, a man who looked like he'd been carved from the town's bedrock, all sharp angles and cold authority. Voss loomed behind the bench, a towering figure at 6'4", his gaunt face framed by a shock of white hair swept back like a vulture's crest. His eyes, small and grey, glinted with something predatory as he shuffled papers, his black robe rustling like wings. The bailiff, a squat man with a permanent scowl, called the room to order, and Jessa felt the weight of every stare settle on her and Jada. They'd opted to represent themselves, no lawyer to buffer Voss's wrath, a choice that felt right until this moment. Jessa stepped forward, her voice clear despite the knot in her stomach. Your Honor, we're here to contest the zoning board's claim. Our farm's been agricultural land for over 50 years. We have the records to prove it. She gestured to the folder, but before Jada could open it, Voss's hand shot up, silencing her. I don't need lectures from your kind, he snapped, his voice a low growl that echoed off the walls. You think you can waltz in here and tell me how to read my own laws? Jessa blinked, caught off guard by the venom, but she held her ground, years of discipline keeping her steady. The judge leaned forward, his buzzard-like stare raking over them. Look at you, he said, his lips curling into a sneer. All dressed up in your little suits, hair twisted up like you're somebody. What's that supposed to prove? That you're not too urban to play farmer? A ripple of snickers ran through the gallery and Jessa's cheeks burned, not with shame, but with a slow, simmering rage. She glanced at Jada, whose fists were clenched, tight, knuckles whitening against her dark skin. Voss wasn't just ruling, he was performing, tearing them down for sport. Jada took a step, her voice cutting through the murmurs. Your Honor, the zoning code from 1985 clearly states agricultural land can't be rezoned without a public vote. There's been no vote. We've got the surveyor's map, tax receipts, everything. She flipped open the folder, sliding a crisp page across the table, but Voss didn't even glance at it. His gavel came down hard, a crack that made Jessa flinch. That's $50 for disrespect, he barked, pointing a bony finger at Jada. You don't talk. Over me, girl, this ain't your playground. Jessa's mind raced. $50 for citing the law? She opened her mouth to protest, but Voss's glare stopped her cold. You got something to say too? He taunted, his tone daring her to push back. Maybe you think you're special, standing there all prim and proper. I've seen plenty, like you thinking you can strut into Elwood and take what ain't yours. The gallery's laughter grew louder, a chorus of approval that made Jessa's stomach twist. She thought of their grandfather, his calloused hands working that land, and how Voss was spitting on every ounce of his sweat. Jada shot her a look, A silent "stay calm," but Jessa could see the fire in her sister's eyes, the same fire she felt blazing inside herself. Voss leaned back, his chair creaking like a warning, and waved a dismissive hand. "This zoning mess needs a full hearing," he said, his voice thick with smugness. "We'll set it for next month, give you time to learn your place." He smirked, a cruel twist of his thin lips. "I'll teach you how things work here." The bailiff called a recess, and Jessa watched Voss stride out, his robe billowing like a storm cloud. She and Jada gathered their papers, the weight of the fine and the judge's words pressing down like the Georgia heat. Outside, the air was no cooler, the sun a relentless spotlight on the courthouse steps. Jada kicked a pebble, sending it skittering across the cracked pavement. "He's not even pretending," she said, her voice low and tight. "That wasn't about zoning. That was about us." Jessa nodded, her braids brushing her shoulders as she adjusted the folder under her arm. "He's got the whole room eating out of his hand," she replied, glancing back at the building. "Did you see their faces? They loved it. The snickers, the nods, it was a show, and they were the punchline." Jessa thought of the rock through their window, the note's jagged scrawl, and now this. A judge turning a legal fight into a public flogging. What kind of town let a man like Voss wield that kind of power? They walked back to the Pineview Motel. In silence, the humidity clinging to their skin, the folder of documents a lifeline they'd barely gotten to use. Jessa replayed Voss's words in her head. "Your kind. Urban. Each one a barb meant to cut deep." She'd faced prejudice before, subtle jabs in college, sidelong glances in uniform. But this was raw, unfiltered, a man with a gavel making it law. Jada unlocked their room, the patched-up window a stark reminder of the stakes. "We've got a month," Jada said, dropping the folder on the bed. "We dig deeper, find more proof. He's not winning this." Jessa sat, her fingers tracing the edge of the zoning summons. "He's not playing fair," she said, her voice steady but edged with steel. "We need to be ready for anything." She thought of their grandfather's farm, the barn's weathered boards, the soil he'd turned by hand, and felt a resolve harden inside her. Voss wanted a fight? He'd get one. But as the day faded into dusk, the town's pulse seemed to quicken. A pickup truck rumbled past the motel, slower than it needed to, its engine a low growl. Jessa peered through the blinds, catching a glimpse of a Confederate flag decal on the tailgate before it vanished into the gloom. She didn't say anything to Jada, who was already poring over their next move, but the unease settled in her gut like a stone. Voss's courtroom wasn't just a stage, it was a signal, a flare shot into Elwood's sky. The fine, the sneers, they were nothing compared to what might be brewing. Jessa lay awake that night, the cicadas drone a restless hum, wondering how far this judge would go to bury them. She didn't know then that this was only the first taste, that the real storm was gathering just beyond the horizon, waiting to break. What do you think of Judge Voss so far? Drop a comment with the number 1 if you think his arrogance is begging for a reckoning. Or 2 if you reckon he's untouchable in a town like Elwood. Smash that like button if you're rooting for Jada and Jessa to turn the tables, and subscribe to catch every twist in this wild ride. Now picture this. The twins have a month to fight back, but what happens when their first win lights a fuse they can't put out? Stick around to find out. Jada Carter hunched over a rickety table in their Pineview motel room, the dim lamp casting jagged shadows across a sprawl of yellowed papers. It was 3 weeks after Judge Voss's courtroom smackdown, and the air in Elwood felt heavier, thicker, with the promise of trouble. She and Jessa had spent every day since digging through their grandfather's past, chasing proof to bury the zoning board's lies. Jada's fingers traced a faded tax receipt from 1974, the ink smudged but legible, showing 50 acres paid in full. Jessa sat across from her, laptop glowing, cross-referencing county records online. They'd found gold, a 1985 surveyor's map, confirming the farm's agricultural status, untouched by any rezoning vote. Jada's chest tightened with a flicker of hope, a rare feeling in this town where every glance felt like a blade. "This is it," she said, tapping the map. "Voss can't argue with this." Jessa looked up, her braids glinting in the light, and nodded. "We need a witness too," she said, her voice steady. "Someone they can't ignore." That someone was Eli Watts, a wiry black farmer with a grizzled beard and a limp from a tractor accident years back. Jada tracked him down at his 10-acre plot on the edge of Elwood, a patch of dusty corn and soybeans baking under the noon sun. He leaned on a fence post, squinting at her through the haze, his overalls stained with earth. "I knew your granddaddy," he said, his voice rough but warm. "Good man. Kept that farm alive when folks like me were losing ours." Jada explained the zoning fight, the summons, Voss's sneers, and handed him the map. Eli rubbed his chin, hesitant, his eyes darting toward town. "Voss don't like being crossed," he muttered. "And I got kids to think about." Jada softened her tone, leaning closer. "We're not asking for much, just the truth. You saw that farm running year after year. Tell them that." Eli sighed, long and heavy, then gave a curt nod. "All right." "For your granddaddy?" Jada felt a surge of triumph, small but real. They had their ammo. The hearing came fast, a muggy morning where the courthouse smelled of sweat and polished oak. Jada stood beside Jessa, their suits crisp despite the heat, the folder of evidence clutched tight. Voss swept in, his robe a black shroud, his buzzard eyes glinting with disdain. The gallery was fuller this time, locals drawn by whispers of the Uppity twins daring to face him again. Jada started, her voice firm, laying out the tax receipts and surveyor's map, each page a brick in their wall. "These prove the farm's been agricultural since 1972, she said, sliding them toward the bench. "No rezoning vote ever happened. The board's claim is baseless." Voss's lips twitched, but he stayed silent, flipping through the papers with a bored flick of his wrist. Jessa called Eli up, and he shuffled forward, his limp more pronounced under the judge's stare. "I saw that farm every season," Eli said, his voice trembling but clear. "Corn, soybeans, even some peaches. It never stopped being farmland." Voss leaned back, his chair groaning, and Jada held her breath. She'd expected a fight, more insults, but the judge's silence stretched, unnerving her. Finally he spoke, his tone flat. "Evidence looks solid. The farm's yours legally." Jada's heart leapt, a rush of relief flooding her veins. She glanced at Jessa, who gave a tiny nod, her lips curling slightly. They'd done it, beaten, Voss at his own game. But then he kept talking, his voice dropping low. "Course there's a catch. County records show a back tax lien, $5,000, due by end of week. Pay it, or the farm's forfeit." He smirked, a cruel glint in his eye, and Jada's stomach sank. 5,000? They'd cleared every tax they'd found. This was new, a trap sprung at the last second. The gallery murmured, a mix of surprise and glee, and Voss banged his gavel. "Court's adjourned. Good luck, ladies." Jada's mind spun as they stumbled out into the blinding sunlight. "He made that up," she hissed, her boots pounding the steps. Jessa clutched the folder, her jaw tight. "Doesn't matter. We've got 4 days." They raced to the bank, a squat building on Main Street with a flickering neon sign. The loan officer, a pinched-faced woman named Doris, clucked her tongue as she reviewed their paperwork. 5,000 steep on short notice," she said, her tone dripping with fake pity. "Collateral's tricky with a farm in dispute." Jada wanted to scream, but Jessa took over, calm and sharp, negotiating terms. Hours ticked by, the clock mocking them from the wall, until Doris finally stamped the approval at 4:55, 5 minutes before closing. Jada's hands shook as she signed, the pen slipping in her sweaty grip. They had the money, wired it to the county that night, and collapsed on their motel beds, exhausted but victorious. "We did it," Jada said, a tired grin breaking through. Jessa laughed, a rare sound, and cracked open 2 warm sodas from their stash. "To Grandad," she toasted, clinking cans. For once, Elwood felt conquerable. Midnight shattered that illusion. Jada woke to a roar outside, engines growling like beasts. She bolted upright, Jessa already at the window, peering through the blinds. "Trucks," Jessa whispered, her voice tight. Headlights slashed the dark, 3 pickups circling the farm a mile away, visible from their perch. Jada's heart slammed against her ribs as orange flickers sparked in the distance, growing into tongues of flame. "The barn," she gasped, grabbing her boots. They sprinted to their rented pickup, the night air thick with the stench of gasoline and smoke. By the time they reached the farm, the barn was a bonfire, its weathered boards collapsing in a storm of sparks. Half the crops, rows of young corn and beans, withered in the heat, blackening to ash. Jada ran toward it, heat searing her face, but Jessa yanked her back. "Too late!" Jessa shouted over the crackle. Shapes moved in the shadows, trucks peeling off into the night, taillights winking like mocking eyes. Jada stood frozen, the deed still in her pocket, now smeared with soot from her hands. The victory in court, the loan, it all felt like a sick joke. She kicked the dirt, a cloud of red dust rising, and turned to Jessa. "Voss," she said, her voice raw. "He tipped them off." Jessa nodded, her eyes scanning the wreckage, fists balled at her sides. "He knew we'd pay," she said. "This is his answer." The fire lit her face, casting harsh lines, and Jada saw the same fury mirrored there. They'd won the land, proved it theirs, and Voss had struck back harder, turning their triumph to cinders. Jada thought of Eli's hesitation, the gallery's snickers, and realized this wasn't just about zoning anymore. It was personal, a message carved in flames. "You don't belong." She wiped her face, smearing ash across her cheek, and felt a cold resolve settle in. They'd saved the farm on paper, but the real fight was just starting. The next morning, the air stank of charred wood as they sifted through the ruins. Jada salvaged a rusted hoe, its handle scorched but intact, a relic of their grandfather's labor. Jessa photographed the damage, her phone clicking steadily, evidence for whatever came next. Neither spoke much, the weight of the night pressing down. Jada kept replaying Voss's smirk, the way he dangled that lean like bait, knowing they'd bite. He'd played them, used the law to lure them into this trap, then let his shadows finish it. She glanced at the horizon where the town slept under a pale dawn and felt a chill despite the rising heat. They'd beaten him once, but at what cost? The barn was gone, the crops halved, and the message was clear. Elwood wouldn't let them win easy. Jada gripped the hoe tighter, her knuckles aching, and met Jessa's eyes. They didn't need words to know they weren't done. Voss had lit the match, but he'd underestimated the fire in them. Jessa Carter stood in the smoldering wreckage of their grandfather's barn, the acrid tang of burnt timber stinging her nose. It was dawn, the morning after the fire that devoured half their farm, and the Georgia sun was already a merciless glare, baking the red clay beneath her boots. Jada knelt nearby, sifting through ash with a scorched hoe, her face streaked with soot and fury. Jessa's phone buzzed in her pocket, a text from their insurance agent. Claim denied, ownership unverified. She stared at the screen, her pulse thudding in her ears. Unverified? They'd paid the lien, one in court, yet here was another. Gut punch, a fresh wound on top of the last. She kicked a charred plank, sending it skittering across the ruin, and turned to Jada. "Insurance won't cover it," she said, her voice tight. "Says we don't own it." Jada's head snapped up, her eyes blazing. "That's Tate," she spat, slamming the hoe into the dirt. "He's screwing us again." They didn't waste time. Jessa drove their rattling pickup to the sheriff's office, a low brick bunker on the edge of Elwood where the air smelled of coffee and gun oil. Sheriff Dwayne Polk lounged behind the desk, a barrel-chested man with a buzz cut and a badge pinned to his khaki uniform. His smirk was a carbon copy of Voss's, and Jessa's stomach twisted as she recognized the family resemblance, cousins cut from the same rotten cloth. She laid out the arson, the trucks, the flames, her words clipped and precise. "We need this investigated," she said, sliding photos of the wreckage across the counter. Polk barely glanced at them, leaning back with a lazy shrug. "No witnesses, no crime," he drawled, his voice thick with boredom. "Could have been lightning, a spark, happens all the time out here." Jessa's jaw clenched. Lightning? In a clear night sky? She pointed to the tire tracks in the photos, deep ruts in the clay. "Those aren't from lightning," she said, her tone sharp. Polk's smirk widened and he tossed the pictures back. "Prove it," he said, then turned to a stack of paperwork, dismissing them like flies. Jessa stormed. Out, Jada trailing her, the heat outside hitting like a slap. "He's in on it," Jada said, her voice low and furious. "Voss's lapdog." Jessa nodded, her mind racing. The fire, the insurance denial, Polk's indifference. It was a machine, gears grinding to crush them. She thought of Clarence. Tate, the county clerk with his oily grin, and knew he was the next link. They drove straight to his office, the same squat building where they'd filed the deed weeks ago. Inside, the air was stale, the fan creaking overhead, and Tate sat behind his counter, flipping through a hunting magazine like he'd been waiting for them. Jessa didn't bother with pleasantries. "Why's our ownership unverified?" she demanded, planting her hands on the counter. "We paid the lien, court ruled it's ours." Tate looked up, his pale eyes glinting with amusement. "Records get messy," he said, shrugging. "Maybe someone filed a dispute. Happens when folks don't belong." Jessa's blood boiled, but she kept her cool, a trick honed in chaos far worse than this. She pulled out her phone, hitting record discreetly, and leaned closer. "Who disputed it?" she asked, her voice calm but edged. Tate's grin faltered, then returned, cockier than before. "Dunno," he said, too casual. "But Voss don't like your type farming here. Makes folks twitchy." Jessa's breath caught, the admission slipping out like oil from a cracked engine. She stopped the recording, pocketing the phone, and met Jada's eyes. They had him. "Thanks," she said, turning to leave, her heart pounding with a mix of dread and triumph. Tate's chuckle followed them out, a sound that promised trouble. Back at the motel, Jessa uploaded the audio to a cloud drive, then sent it to Mia Chen, a blogger they'd met at the diner, a wiry woman with a nose for stories. Mia posted it, online within hours, tagging it, "Elwood Corruption." By nightfall, it was everywhere, retweets lighting up Jessa's phone, comments piling up from strangers calling Tate a stooge, Voss a tyrant. Jessa felt a rush, a crack in the wall they'd been slamming against. She showed Jada, who grinned, fierce and fleeting. "Let's see Voss squirm," Jada said, cracking her knuckles. But the high didn't last. At 8, a courier banged on their door, shoving an eviction notice into Jessa's hands. "Code violations," it read, signed by Voss himself. "Burned. Barn's a public hazard. Vacate by week's end." Jessa stared at the paper, her victory turning sour. "He's hitting back," she said, her voice hollow. Jada snatched it, reading aloud. "Hazard? He knows damn well who burned it." Jessa's mind spun, connecting dots. The fire, Polk shrugged, Tate's sabotage, now this. Voss wasn't just fighting, he was orchestrating. She paced the room, the carpet crunching under her boots, while Jada called Mia. "Can this stick?" Jada asked, her voice urgent. Mia's reply crackled through the speaker. "Legally shaky, but Voss runs this town. You need more." Jessa stopped pacing, her eyes narrowing. More meant exposing Voss, turning that audio into a weapon. She posted it herself, a raw caption, "Elwood's judge wants us gone." It spread faster, likes ticking up, a small army of outrage building online. Jessa thought they'd flipped the script, that the world watching might shield them. She was wrong. At 2 in the morning, boots thudded outside their motel room. Jessa jolted awake, Jada already up, peering through the blinds. "Cops," Jada whispered, her voice tight. The door burst open, splintering wood, and Sheriff Polk stormed in, flanked by 2 deputies with flashlights and drawn guns. "Hands up," Polk barked, his smirk gone, replaced by a cold glare. Jessa raised her arms, her heart slamming against her ribs as a deputy snatched her phone from the nightstand. "Evidence," Polk said, waving a warrant. "You're stirring trouble, posting lies." Jada lunged for her own phone, but a deputy pinned her arm, yanking it free. "That's ours," Jada shouted, struggling, but Polk just laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "Not anymore," he said, pocketing the devices. "Judge says you're a nuisance. We'll see what's on here." They were gone as fast as they'd come, leaving the room trashed, papers scattered. The eviction notice crumpled on the floor. Jessa sank onto the bed, her hands shaking, while Jada kicked the wall, leaving a dent. "They took everything," Jada said, her voice raw. "The recording, the photos, all of it." Jessa's mind raced, replaying Polk's words. "Judge says." Voss wasn't squirming, he was striking, using Polk to gut their fight. She thought of the online buzz, the hope it had sparked, now snuffed out by a raid. "They're scared," she said, forcing calm into her voice. "That audio hit a nerve." Jada nodded, her eyes burning. "Good, let's hit harder." But Jessa wasn't so sure. The eviction loomed, their proof was gone, and Voss's machine was rolling over them, relentless and cruel. The next day they went to Eli's farm, hoping for backup, but he wouldn't meet their eyes. "Can't help no more," he mumbled, staring at his boots. "Folks been asking questions." Jessa saw fear in his hunched shoulders, the same fear she'd felt when Polk's gun flashed in her face. They were alone again, the town closing ranks. She thought of their grandfather, his quiet strength, and felt a pang of loss. He'd fought for that land, and now they were losing it piece by piece to a system that hated them for existing. Jessa clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. Voss thought he'd won this round, but she'd faced worse odds, stared down bigger threats. This wasn't over, not yet. Think Sheriff Polk's covering for Voss's blatant corruption? Comment number 1 if you agree he's dirty, or 2 if you think he's just following orders. Hit that like button if you're raging at how Jada and Jessa keep getting slammed, and subscribe to see if they can claw their way out of this mess. Now, imagine this. They've got nothing left but their grit. So what happens when they drop? A bombshell that shakes Elwood to its core? Stay tuned to find out. Jada Carter's boots crunched against the gravel outside Elwood's courthouse, her pulse hammering as she climbed the steps with Jessa at her side. It was 3 days after Sheriff Polk's raid had stripped them bare, their phones gone, their evidence snatched, and the eviction notice looming like a guillotine. The Georgia heat pressed down, a wet shroud that soaked her blazer, but Jada's focus was razor sharp. Voss had called an emergency hearing, claiming the public hazard of their burned barn demanded immediate action. Jada knew it was a kill shot, a chance to bury them under his gavel before the online fire from Tate's recorded slip could spread further. She clutched a slim folder, all they'd managed to scrape together since the raid. Photocopies of tax receipts borrowed from Eli's reluctant hands. Jessa's jaw was set, her braids pulled tight, her eyes glinting with the same fire Jada felt, burning in her chest. They'd lost too much to back down now. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with a fuller crowd, locals packed into the pews, their murmurs sharp with anticipation. Word of the raid had trickled out, twisted by gossip into tales of the twins stirring chaos. Jada spotted Mia Chen in the back, the blogger's phone discreetly raised, live tweeting every move. The air smelled of sweat and polished wood, the fan overhead creaking uselessly against the humidity. Judge Raymond Voss swept in, his robe a dark ripple, his buzzard eyes locking onto them with a glint of triumph. He settled behind the bench, his gaunt face carved with smugness, and banged his gavel. "Order!" he barked, though the room was already still. "We're here to settle this nonsense once and for all. Miss Carter, your barn's a blight. Eviction's overdue." His voice dripped with glee, and Jada's fists clenched, nails biting into her palms. Jessa stepped forward, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "Your Honor, the barn burned because of arson, not neglect. We've reported it. And the sheriff's done nothing. This eviction's retaliation." Voss's lips curled, a sneer splitting his face. "Retaliation?" he scoffed, leaning forward. "You think I care about your little sob story? That farm's a mess, and you've got no proof it's even yours anymore. I've seen the records, or lack of them." Jada's stomach twisted. Polk's raid had gutted their case, and Voss knew it, reveling in the trap he'd sprung. The IE gallery shifted, a low hum of agreement rising, and Jada felt the walls closing in. She thought of the farm, their grandfather's legacy, now ash and dirt, and the rage boiled over. She couldn't let him win, not like this. She took a step, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Enough," she said, loud enough to make Voss flinch. "You've been playing us from the start, twisting laws, sending your dogs to burn us out, but you don't know who you're messing with." The room hushed, every eye on her, and Jada locked gazes with Voss. "We're U.S. Army Rangers, trained at Fort Bragg. We've fought worse than you in places you'd never survive." Her words landed like a grenade. the silence shattering into gasps. Jessa straightened beside her, nodding, and Jada pressed on. "We've led recon missions, disarmed bombs, taken fire, while you sat here picking on folks who can't fight back. You think you're tough? You're nothing." Voss's face froze, his smirk vanishing, his grey eyes widening for a split second before narrowing again. The gallery erupted, whispers exploding into a roar, and Mia's fingers flew across her phone, the tweet storm igniting. Jada's heart pounded, a mix of adrenaline and vindication surging through her. She'd held that card close. Their army passed a shield they hadn't planned to flash, but Voss had pushed too far. Jessa added, her voice calm but firm, "We didn't abandon that farm. We served our country, left it in a caretaker's hands, and came back to claim what's ours. You've got no right to take it." Voss's hand twitched toward his gavel, but he hesitated, the room's energy shifting against him. Mia's live feed hit hundreds, then thousands, comments flooding in, calling him out by name. Jada saw the flicker of doubt in his stare, the first crack in his armor. He cleared his throat, his voice thinner now. "Well," he said, forcing a chuckle, "that's a fancy tale, but it don't change facts. Still, I'll dismiss the eviction for now. Hearing's over." He banged, the gavel weaker this time, and stood, his robe swishing as he retreated to his chambers. Jada exhaled, her knees trembling beneath her steady stance. They'd done it, turned his game upside down, bought time. Jessa grabbed her arm, a rare grin breaking through. "We shook him," she said, her voice low. He didn't see that coming. They filed out, the crowd parting, some nodding with grudging respect, others glaring with fresh hate. Outside, the air was thick, the sun dipping low, painting the sky orange. Jada felt lighter, the weight of the eviction lifted, if only for a moment. They walked to the Pineview Motel, the gravel crunching underfoot, and Jessa pulled out a spare burner phone they'd snagged after the raid. "Mia's blowing up," she said, scrolling. "Folks are pissed, this might actually work." Jada nodded, her mind racing. The army reveal wasn't just a flex, it was a flare, a signal to Elwood. And beyond that, they weren't prey. They crashed in their room, the patched window letting in a cool breeze, and Jada cracked open a soda, passing another to Jessa. "To kicking his ass," she toasted, clinking cans. Jessa laughed, and for a fleeting hour they savored it, the taste of defiance, sharp and sweet. That taste soured fast. At 11, the night was still, the cicadas a relentless hum, when a crash split the silence. Jada bolted upright, Jessa already at the window, her silhouette tense. A brick lay on the carpet, glass glittering around it like spilled stars, a note taped to its rough edge. Jada snatched it, her hands steady despite the adrenaline spiking through her. "Rangers bleed too," it read, the letters jagged and black, a promise dripping with venom. Jessa's breath hitched, her eyes scanning the dark beyond the blinds, but the street was empty, the threat a ghost in the shadows. Jada crumpled the note, her knuckles whitening, and met Jessa's gaze. "Voss," she said, her voice a growl. "He's not done." Jessa nodded, her face hardening. "He's pissed we called him out. This is personal now." Jada paced, the room feeling smaller, the walls pressing in. She'd expected pushback, but not this fast, not this raw. The army card had humiliated Voss, stripped his swagger in front of his kingdom, and he'd lashed out, a wounded animal bearing teeth. She thought of the fire, the raid, and now this, each blow sharper, meaner. Jessa sat, her fingers drumming the bed, her mind clearly churning. "He's got the town scared," she said, her voice low. "But we've got eyes on us now, that's our edge." Jada stopped, nodding slowly. Mia's tweets, the online roar, it was a shield, thin but real. They weren't alone anymore, not entirely. She grabbed the brick, hefting its weight, and set it by the door, a grim trophy. "Let him try," she said, her voice steady. "We've taken worse hits. Sleep didn't come easy that night." The brick a silent sentinel, the note's words looping in Jada's head. She thought of Fort Bragg, the grueling nights in the mud, the instructors screaming until her ears rang, the missions where one wrong step meant death. Voss was a bully with a gavel, not a soldier, but he fought dirty and Elwood was his battlefield. Jessa's breathing evened out beside her, But Jada stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, the fan's creak a metronome to her. Thoughts. They'd won a round, made him blink, but the war was heating up. She felt the familiar itch of a fight, the kind that demanded every ounce of her, and knew Jessa felt it too. Voss thought he'd scare them off, but he'd lit a fuse he couldn't snuff. The farm, their grandfather's blood in the soil, it was worth it all, and they'd prove it one way or another. Jessa Carter woke to the faint rumble of engines cutting through the pre-dawn stillness, her senses snapping alert like a tripwire. It was 4 days after the brick shattered their motel window, the note's threat, "Rangers bleed too," still etched in her mind. She rolled off the bed, her bare feet hitting the carpet, and peered through the blinds of their Pineview motel room. The sky was a bruised purple, the first streaks of light bleeding over Elwood's horizon, but the sound wasn't traffic. It was closer, guttural, coming from the farm a mile away. Jada stirred, her voice thick with sleep. "What's that?" Jessa's stomach knotted as headlights flickered through the trees, 3, then 4, weaving toward their grandfather's land. "Trouble," she said, yanking on her boots. Jada was up in seconds, pulling a hoodie over her tank top, her eyes sharp with the same instinct Jessa felt humming in her bones. They grabbed their burner phone and bolted to the rented pickup, the engine coughing to life as Jessa floored it down Highway 6. The air was cool, thick with the scent of dew and pine, but Jessa's palms sweated against the wheel. She thought of the army reveal, how it had rocked Voss in court, the online storm it sparked. Mia Chen's tweets had hit 10,000 shares, strangers cheering them on, but Elwood wasn't the internet. Here, Voss's word was gospel, and that brick was his warning shot. The farm came into view, 50 acres of shadow and soil, the charred barn a skeletal ruin against the dawn. Jessa slammed the brakes as 6 pickups roared into the field, their tires chewing ruts into the clay. Men spilling out with hoods pulled low and bats glinting in their hands. "Get out!" Jada hissed, grabbing a tire iron from the truck bed. Jessa followed, her pulse a war drum, every step crunching gravel as they faced the mob. The air crackled with shouts as the men fanned out, their faces hidden behind bandanas, but their intent was naked. "You don't belong here," one snarled, his voice muffled but venomous, swinging a bat at the farmhouse porch. Wood splintered, the sound a gunshot in the quiet, and Jessa lunged, shoving him back. "This is ours!" she yelled, her voice raw. But another figure tackled her from the side, slamming her into the dirt. Pain exploded in her ribs, her vision blurring as boots rained down, kicking her arms, her back. She curled tight, protecting. Her head, army training kicking in. But the blows kept coming, relentless, a storm of hate. Jada's shout cut through, fierce and wild, and Jessa glimpsed her sister swinging the tire iron, cracking a knee, then an elbow. The mob swarmed Jada, dragging her toward the tractor, a chain clanking as they looped it around her wrists, pinning her to the rusted frame. Jessa's world spun, blood trickling from her lip, but she forced herself up, staggering as a bat grazed her shoulder. She saw the spray cans next, red paint hissing across the farmhouse walls, slurs jagged and bold. "Go back. No place here." A voice bellowed over the chaos. "Voss sends his regards," and Jessa's blood ran cold. This wasn't random. See, it was a hit ordered from the bench. She stumbled toward Jada, who thrashed against the chain, her hoodie torn, her face a mask of fury. The mob laughed, a guttural chorus, until headlights flared from the road. Eli Watts's old Ford screeched in, his horn blaring, and the attackers froze. Eli leapt out, shotgun in hand, his limp forgotten as he roared, "Get off my neighbors! Land!" The mob scattered, truck engines revving as they peeled out, leaving dust and destruction in their wake. Jessa dropped to her knees, gasping as Eli rushed over, his hands trembling as he unchained Jada. "Saw 'em from my place," he panted, his beard flecked with sweat. "Couldn't let it stand." Jada rubbed her wrists, red welts blooming, and pulled Jessa up, her grip fierce. "You okay?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Jessa nodded, wincing, her ribs screaming with every breath. The farmhouse stood defiled, paint dripping like blood. The remaining crops trampled into mush. Jessa's legs shook, but she forced herself to stand, leaning on Jada as Eli scanned the horizon. "They'll be back," he said, his voice low. "Voss, don't quit." Jessa thought of the courtroom, his faltering smirk, and knew Eli was right. The army reveal had wounded him, and this was his counterstrike, brutal and personal. They barely had time to catch their breath before sirens wailed, 2 sheriff's cruisers tearing up the road. Sheriff Dwayne Polk stepped out, his bulk filling the dawn light, his smirk back in place. "Well, well," he said, sauntering over, his deputies flanking him with hands on holsters. "Looks like a riot. You two causing trouble again?" Jessa's jaw dropped, disbelief warring with pain. "We were attacked," she said, pointing to the paint, the chains, her own bruised. "Bice, they nearly killed us." Polk's eyes flicked over the scene, dismissive, then landed on Eli. "You see anything, Watts?" Eli hesitated, his shotgun lowering, and Jessa saw the fear creep back into his stance. "Just got here," he mumbled, looking away. Polk chuckled, a dry, hollow sound, and pulled out handcuffs. "Inciting a riot's a crime," he said, nodding to his deputies. "Cuff 'em." Jada lunged, her tire iron still in hand, but a deputy wrestled it free, slamming her against the truck. "You're framing us," she shouted, struggling as cold metal bit into her wrists. Jessa tried to pull away, her ribs throbbing, but another deputy pinned her arm, snapping cuffs tight. "This is Voss," Jessa gasped, her voice ragged. "You're his errand boy." Polk's smirk widened, and he leaned close, his breath sour with coffee. "Keep talking," he said. "Jail's got room for big mouths." They were shoved into the cruiser, the doors slamming shut, the farm receding as Polk drove them into town. Jessa pressed her forehead to the window, her reflection bruised and battered, and felt a hollow ache. They'd survived the mob, but this was worse, a trap snapping shut. At the station, a concrete box stinking of bleach and rust. They were thrown into a cell, the bars clanging behind them. Jada paced, her hoodie shredded, her wrists raw, while Jessa slumped against the wall, her head pounding. Footsteps echoed, and 2 guards lingered outside, their voices low but clear. "Voss wants 'em lost," one muttered, his tone casual. "Paperwork can disappear." The other laughed, a sharp bark. "Easy enough. Accidents happen." Jessa's blood chilled, her eyes meeting Jada's across the dim cell. Lost? They weren't just facing charges, they were targets, pawns in Voss's game to erase them. Jada's fists clenched, her voice a whisper. "We're getting out." Jessa nodded, her mind racing, army instincts flaring. They'd faced death before, but this was a different war, and Voss was raising the stakes to murder. Should Eli have stayed silent under Polk's glare? Comment number 1 if you think he choked out of fear, or 2 if you reckon he's playing it smart to survive. Smash that like button if you're stunned by Voss's mob sending a message this brutal, and subscribe to catch every heart-pounding turn in this fight. Now picture the twins locked up, battered but unbowed, so what happens when they pull a move that flips the whole game? Keep watching to see it unfold. Joda Carter's breath fogged the dim air of the Elwood jail cell, her wrists aching where the cuffs had bitten into her skin. It was midnight, hours after Sheriff Polk had locked them up on a trumped-up riot charge, the mob's brutal attack. Still fresh in her bruised bones, the concrete walls pressed in, cold and damp, the only light a flickering bulb casting jagged shadows across the bars. Jessa sat against the wall, her ribs wrapped in pain from the beating, her face swollen but her eyes sharp, glinting with the same resolve Jada felt simmering inside. They'd overheard the guards' chilling plan to lose them. A death sentence whispered in casual tones, and Jada knew they weren't waiting for Voss's next move. She flexed her fingers, testing the stiffness, and met Jessa's gaze. "We're not dying here," she said, her voice a low growl. Jessa nodded, shifting to her knees, her braids brushing the floor as she scanned the cell. Jada's army training kicked in, years at Fort Bragg, where survival wasn't a hope, but a skill. She slipped a bobby pin from her hair, a thin metal lifeline she'd kept hidden since the raid, and knelt by the lock. Her hands moved steady, precise, the pin bending into a makeshift pick as she worked the tumblers, her ears straining for footsteps. Jessa crawled to the bars, peering down the hall where 2 guards slouched in chairs, their snores a ragged rhythm over the hum of a radio. 30 seconds, Jessa whispered, her voice tight but calm. Jada's fingers twisted, sweat beading on her brow, until a soft click echoed, the lock giving way. She eased the door open, the hinges groaning faintly, and Jessa slipped through, her boots silent on the concrete. Jada followed, her heart slamming against her ribs, every shadow a threat as they crept past the guards, their slumped forms oblivious in the stale air. The station was a maze of dim corridors, the stink of bleach, and rust-thick, but Jada knew the layout from their booking. She led Jessa to a side exit, a rusted door by the evidence room, and shouldered it open, the night air rushing in, cool and sharp with pine. They sprinted into the woods behind the jail, branches snapping underfoot, the darkness swallowing them whole. Jada's lungs burned, her legs pumping through the undergrowth, Jessa's labored breathing close behind. They didn't stop until the trees thickened a mile out, where the cicadas' drone drowned their gasps. Jada leaned against an oak, her hoodie snagging on bark, and checked Jessa, whose hand pressed her ribs, pain etched in her grimace. "We made it," Jada said, her voice rough. Jessa nodded, forcing a thin smile. For now. They trekked to Eli Watts's farm, a half-hour stumble through the dark, guided by the faint glow of his porch light. Eli answered their knock, his shotgun in hand, his grizzled face paling at their battered state. "Lord," he muttered, ushering them in, "y'all look like hell." His kitchen smelled of coffee and liniment, a cluttered haven of peeling wallpaper and mismatched chairs. Jada sank onto a stool, her body screaming, while Jessa explained the mob, the arrest, the guard's threat. Eli's hands shook as he poured water, his eyes darting to the windows. "Voss's got claws," he said, low and grim. "I should have done more." Jada waved it off, too tired for blame. "Are you here now?" she said, gulping the water, its chill cutting through her haze. Eli dug out a prepaid phone from a drawer, handing it to Jessa. "Call who you need," he said. Jessa dialed Mia Chen, the blogger's voice crackling. Through, sharp with worry. "You're out?" "Poke's spinning it like you assaulted deputies." Jessa snorted, wincing at the pain. "Lies. We've got bigger problems." She briefed Mia on the mob, Voss's reach, and Mia patched in Tara Reid, a lawyer she'd tracked down in Savannah, a woman with a rep for fighting dirty cases. Tara's voice was crisp, no nonsense. "Poke's raid was illegal, no probable cause. I'll file an injunction. Get a state trooper involved." Jada felt a spark of hope, thin but real as Tara worked fast, her keystrokes audible over the line. By dawn, a trooper arrived at Eli's, a lanky man named Hicks with a buzz cut and a clipped tone. He handed back their seized phones, retrieved, from Poke's lockup under Tara's writ, and Jada clutched hers, the weight a lifeline. Tara's injunction hit the county courthouse that morning, a legal bomb halting the farm's seizure and freezing Poke's charges. Jada scrolled Mia's latest post, the audio of Tate's slip reposted with a new headline, "Elwood Sheriff frames Army vets." It exploded online, shares climbing past 20,000, a roar of outrage Jada could almost hear. She grinned at Jessa, her split lips stinging. "We're back in it," she said, and Jessa nodded, her eyes gleaming despite the bruises. They thanked Eli, who pressed a thermos of coffee into their hands, his grip firm. "Stay sharp," he said, his voice rough with guilt. Jada clapped his shoulder, a silent truce, and they stepped into the morning, the sun a pale disk through the pines. The injunction was a win, a crack in Voss's wall, and with their phones back they had teeth again. Jada felt the tide shifting, a glimmer of control after days of chaos. That glimmer snuffed out fast. They headed to the farm, a half-mile walk, to check the damage, the air thick with humidity and the buzz of flies. Jada's boots sank into the clay, her eyes on the trampled crops, when a sharp crack split the silence. She dove, tackling Jessa into the ditch beside the road, her body shielding her sister as dirt sprayed around them. A bullet whizzed past, grazing Jada's shoulder, a hot sting tearing through her flesh. She cursed, rolling off Jessa, her hand, clamping the wound, blood seeping through her fingers. Jessa scrambled up, her eyes wide, scanning the tree line where the shot had come. "Sniper," she whispered, her voice taut. Another crack rang out, the bullet thunking into a pine, and Jada pulled Jessa low, crawling through the ditch, mud caking their knees. They reached a cluster of oaks, panting, Jada's shoulder throbbing as blood dripped down her arm. Jessa tore a strip from her shirt, binding the graze, her hands steady despite the panic in her eyes. "Voss," Jada growled, her voice shaking with rage. A faint whisper carried on the wind. "Voss," an echo from the shadows confirming. Jada's mind raced. The injunction, the online storm, it had cornered him. And this was his answer, a kill shot in broad daylight. She thought of the mob, the brick, each blow escalating, and now this, a sniper hunting them like prey. Jessa's face hardened, her fingers tightening the makeshift bandage. "He's desperate," she said, her voice low. "Means we're winning." Jada nodded, pain sharpening her focus. They'd escaped jail, turned the law against Polk, but Voss wasn't playing by rules anymore. They staggered back to Eli's, the thermos abandoned in the ditch, Jada's blood staining the path. Eli met them at the door, his shotgun raised, his eyes widening at the sight. "Sniper?" he asked, incredulous, and Jada nodded, collapsing onto his couch. Jessa grabbed the phone, calling Tara, her voice urgent. "We're targets now," she said, detailing the shot, the whisper. Tara's reply was grim. "Voss is off the rails, I'll push the feds." Jada leaned back, her shoulder pulsing, the room spinning as exhaustion crashed over her. They'd clawed out of one trap, flipped the script, but Voss had raised the stakes to murder. She thought of Fort Bragg, the drills where death was a breath away, and felt that old steel rise in her gut. They weren't done, not by a long shot, but the war had just turned deadly. Jessa Carter pressed a damp cloth to Jada's shoulder, the blood-soaked strip of shirt she'd tied earlier, now a crusty red against her sister's skin. It was dusk, hours after the sniper's bullet had grazed Jada in that ditch, and they were holed up in Eli Watts's kitchen, the air thick with the scent of coffee and antiseptic. Jada winced, her jaw tight, as Jessa cleaned the wound, the sting cutting through the fog of exhaustion. Eli hovered nearby, his grizzled hands wringing a rag, his shotgun propped by the door after their frantic return. The sniper's whisper, "Voss?" still echoed in Jessa's ears, a ghost of intent that turned her stomach. She'd patched Jada up with army-honed calm, but inside her nerves were a live wire, sparking with every creak of the old house. Jada met her eyes, her voice rough but steady. "We're still here," she said, a grim promise. Jessa nodded, her braids brushing her shoulders, and grabbed the prepaid phone to call Tara Reid, their lawyer fighting from Savannah. Tara's voice crackled through, sharp and urgent. "Sniper? That's attempted murder. I'm escalating this now." Jessa briefed her on the shot, the ditch, the blood. Her words clipped as she paced the linoleum floor. Tara didn't flinch. "I've got the injunction filed, and I'm pushing." The state judge for Voss's suspension. This is evidence. By morning, the news hit like a storm. Mia Chen, their blogger ally, posted Jada's bloodied shoulder, the ditch's bullet scars, captioning it, "Elwood Judge targets Army vets." The internet erupted, shares soaring past 50,000. Hashtags like "Justice for Carters" trending as strangers flooded the streets outside the courthouse. Jessa watched it unfold on Eli's ancient laptop, her breath catching at drone footage of 100 protesters chanting their names, signs stabbing the air. Voss must go. Jada leaned over, her shoulder bandaged now, a rare grin tugging her split lip. "They're with us," she said, her voice hoarse with wonder. Tara dug deeper, uncovering Voss's financial ties to a developer, Hargrove Realty, a slick outfit eyeing the farm for a strip mall. Bank records showed payments funneled through shell accounts, a paper trail Tara filed in a corruption suit against Voss and Polk. Jessa's heart raced as Tara faxed the docs to Eli's creaky machine, each page a nail in Voss's coffin. A state judge in Atlanta, a stern woman named Lila Grant, reviewed the evidence and suspended Voss pending investigation, her ruling flashing across news feeds by noon. Polk's riot charges crumbled under the injunction, the trooper Hicks delivering the dismissal papers to Eli's door with a curt nod. Jessa clutched the documents, her ribs still aching from the mob, and felt a surge of triumph, a peak she hadn't dared imagine. "He's off the bench," she said, handing them to Jada, who punched the air despite the pain. They returned to the farm that afternoon, the air buzzing with flies and the faint char of the barn's ruin. Jessa knelt in the trampled field, planting new corn seeds with Jada, their hands sinking into the clay, a defiant stand against Voss's war. Protesters lined the road, a ragtag mix of locals and out-of-towners, cheering as the twins worked, cameras flashing. Jessa wiped sweat from her brow, her braids sticking to her neck, and felt the crowd's roar like a shield, a wall Voss couldn't breach. Jada straightened, her bandage peeking from her sleeve, and waved, her grin fierce. "This is ours," she shouted, and the cheers doubled, a wave of sound rolling over the 50 acres. Jessa thought of their grandfather, his quiet pride, and believed for a fleeting moment they'd won, that the world's eyes would hold Voss at bay. That belief shattered at midnight. Jessa was dozing in the farmhouse, the windows cracked to let in the cool night air, when a low rumble shook the floor. Her eyes snapped open, her body tensing as the sound grew, a deep thud that rattled her bones. Jada bolted up beside her, shouting, "Get down!" Before Jessa could move, an explosion tore through the night, a fireball erupting from the kitchen, blasting glass and wood across the room. The force threw Jessa back, her head slamming the wall, her ears ringing as flames roared up the curtains. Jada grabbed her arm, dragging her through the smoke, choking on ash as they stumbled out the splintered door. The farmhouse buckled, a inferno swallowing their grandfather's home, the walls collapsing in a storm of sparks. Jessa fell to her knees in the dirt, coughing, her vision swimming as Jada pulled her clear. The heat seared her face, the crackle deafening, and she stared at the ruin, numb with shock. Everything, the beds, the photos, the last traces of their grandfather gone in seconds. Jada's hands shook, blood trickling from a cut on her forehead, her voice raw. "Voss," she said, spitting the name like poison. Jessa's mind reeled. The suspension, the protests, they'd cornered him, and this was his answer, a bomb to erase them. Sirens wailed in the distance, too late, as neighbors emerged, their faces pale in the firelight. Jessa sifted through the ashes, her fingers brushing a melted spoon, all that remained, and felt a hollow rage ignite. They'd reclaimed the farm, turned the tide, but Voss had struck back harder, deadlier. The next morning, TV crews swarmed the wreckage, Mia's camera catching Jada's bloodied face, Jessa's soot-streaked arms. Voss appeared on a local station, his gaunt features twisted in a rehearsed frown, claiming justice for troublemakers who torched their own land. Jessa's stomach churned, his lie a slap after the blast, but the crowd's shouts drowned him out, protesters screaming, "Liar!" Outside his office, Jada kicked a charred plank, her voice trembling with fury. "He thinks he's untouchable," she said, and Jessa nodded, her ribs throbbing, her resolve hardening. They'd survived the mob, the sniper, and now this, each. Blow a testament to Voss's desperation. She thought of the seeds they'd planted, now ash, and knew the fight wasn't over, not while he still breathed free. Was that explosion Voss's ultimate power play, or just pure cowardice? Comment number 1 if you think he's a monster who'll stop at nothing. Or 2 if you reckon he's scared and slipping. Hit that like button if you're gutted for Jada and Jessa losing everything again, and subscribe to see how they rise. From these ashes. Now imagine the twins with nothing left but rage. So what happens when the people they trust turn their backs at the worst moment? Stay locked in to find out. Jada Carter sifted through the smoldering rubble of their grandfather's farmhouse, her boots crunching ash as the Georgia sun beat down, merciless and bright. It was 2 days after the explosion that leveled their home, the air still thick, with the stink of charred wood and melted plastic. Jessa knelt nearby, salvaging a bent photo frame, its glass cracked but the faded image of their grandfather intact, his smile a ghost in the ruin. Jada's shoulder throbbed under its bandage, the sniper's graze a dull ache beneath the fresh cuts from flying debris. Her head pounded from the gash on her forehead, scabbed over now, but she ignored it, her hands trembling with a fury she couldn't shake. The farm was theirs again, the state judge's ruling and the protests had forced Voss off the bench, but this loss cut deeper, a wound no injunction could heal. She glanced at Jessa, whose bruised face mirrored her own, and felt a knot tighten in her chest. They'd fought too hard for this. Eli Watts had taken them in again, his cramped kitchen their refuge as Tara Reid, their lawyer, drove up from Savannah. Tara burst through the door, her suit rumpled from the road, her sharp eyes blazing with purpose. "We've got Voss on the ropes," she said, slapping a stack of papers on the table. "Hargrove Realty's payments trace straight to his accounts. The corruption suit's airtight." Jada leaned over, scanning the bank records, her pulse quickening at the numbers, thousands funneled through dummy firms. Jessa nodded, her voice steady despite the strain. "He's suspended, but he's still pulling strings. That explosion wasn't random." Tara's jaw tightened, and she pulled out her phone, dialing a federal contact. "I'm pushing for an ATF investigation," she said. "A bomb's felony territory. They'll tie it to him." Jada felt a flicker of hope, fragile, but real. As Tara worked, her voice a lifeline in the chaos. They leaned on Tara hard that day, her legal savvy their anchor. She filed motions to freeze Voss's assets, citing the developer ties, and coordinated with Mia Chen to keep the online pressure boiling. Jessa brewed coffee, the bitter scent filling Eli's kitchen, while Jada paced, her boots scuffing the linoleum. "We need Eli's testimony," Jada said, stopping to face Tara. "He saw the mob. That links Voss to the violence." Tara nodded, scribbling notes, but when Jessa called Eli in, the air shifted. He shuffled through the door, his grizzled beard streaked with sweat, his eyes darting to the floor. "I can't," he said, his voice a broken rasp. "They came last night, said they'd kill my kids if I talked." Jada's stomach sank, her fists balling at her sides. "Who?" she demanded, but Eli just shook his head, sobbing now. "Voss's people. I'm sorry." He stumbled out, leaving silence in his wake, a betrayal that stung worse than the snipers. "Bullet?" Jada turned to Tara, her voice trembling with rage. "He's our witness. We need him." Tara's face hardened, but she sighed, setting her pen down. "Without him, it's thinner," she said. "But we've got enough." Jessa gripped the photo frame, her knuckles whitening. "He's scared," she said, low and bitter. "Voss owns this town." Jada wanted to chase Eli down, shake him until he fought back, but the fear in his eyes stopped her cold. She thought of his kids, 2 girls she'd seen playing in his yard, and felt the weight of his choice, a coward's shield she couldn't pierce. Tara rallied them, pushing forward with the corruption case, but the crack in their armor widened that night. Jessa woke to a crash, Tara's rental car outside Eli's house, its windows smashed, papers strewn across the gravel. A note fluttered, "In the mess. Back off or disappear." Tara stormed in, her face pale, and tossed it on the table. "I can't fight this," she said, her voice cracking. "I'm out." Jada's heart stopped, her breath catching as Tara grabbed her bag, her heels clicking toward the door. "You're leaving?" Jessa asked, stepping in her path, her ribs aching with every word. Tara's eyes glistened, but she nodded. "They know where I live," she said, soft and final. "I've got a daughter, too." She left without another word, the car's engine fading into the night, abandoning them in a house that suddenly felt too small. Jada sank onto a chair, her head in her hands, the sting of betrayal doubling down. First Eli, now Tara, their allies peeling away under Voss's shadow. Jessa stood frozen, the photo frame slipping to the floor, its glass shattering anew. "We're alone," she whispered, and Jada nodded, her throat tight. They'd trusted too much, and Voss had sniffed it out, striking where it hurt. The next blow came fast, a grand jury summons taped to Eli's door by morning. Jada tore it open, her eyes scanning the text. "Jada and Jessa Carter, indicted for arson, destruction of property." She laughed, a harsh, hollow sound, and handed it to Jessa, whose face darkened. "They're saying we burned our own farm," Jessa said, her voice flat with disbelief. The jury, stacked with Voss's cronies, old men in suits who'd nodded at his courtroom rants, had convened in secret, twisting the explosion into a frame-up. Jada's mind raced to Polk, the sheriff's smirk, and she knew he'd planted this seed. They drove to the farm, the wreckage still cordoned off, and Jada spotted him in the distance, his khaki uniform stark against the ash. He knelt by a scorched beam, slipping something into the debris, a glint of steel catching the sun. Jessa squinted, her breath hitching. "That's your ranger knife," she said, and Jada's blood ran cold, her hand flying to her empty pocket. Polk stood, dusting his hands, and sauntered over, his smirk wide as ever. "Found evidence," he said, holding up the knife. "Its blade, etched with her initials from Fort Bragg. Funny how it turned up here." Jada lunged, her fists clenched, but Jessa grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "He's baiting us," Jessa hissed, her voice urgent. Polk chuckled, pocketing the knife, and waved a deputy over. "Cuff 'em," he said, casual as ordering. "Coffee." The cold steel snapped around Jada's wrists again, her shoulder screaming as they tightened, and Jessa struggled beside her, her ribs flaring with pain. "This is a lie," Jada shouted, her voice echoing across the field. But Polk just shrugged, turning away as the deputies shoved them into a cruiser. The farm receded, a blackened scar on the horizon, and Jada's rage boiled over, her fists pounding the seat until her knuckles bled. They were booked again, the station's bleach stink of familiar hell, and tossed into a cell, the bars clanging shut with a finality that sank into Jada's bones. Jessa slumped against the wall, her braids falling loose, her eyes hollow. "They've got us," she said, her voice barely audible. Jada paced, her boots scuffing the concrete, her mind replaying Polk's smug plant, Eli's tears, Tara's exit. Voss wasn't on the bench, but his shadow stretched long, puppeting Polk, breaking their circle. She thought of the protests, the online roar, now silent as their allies fled, and felt a despair she hadn't known since the darkest nights at Bragg. "Not yet," she said, forcing steel into her voice. "We're not done." Jessa nodded, faint but firm, and Jada clung to that spark, thin as it was. They'd been framed, betrayed, but they'd survived worse, and Voss's web wasn't unbreakable, not if they could find a thread to pull. Jada Carter sat shackled in the Elwood courthouse, her wrists raw from the cuffs that had become too familiar, the air thick with the musk of old wood and nervous sweat. It was a week after Sheriff Polk framed them for arson, planting her ranger, knife in the farmhouse rubble, and now she and Jessa faced a grand jury's indictment in a trial that reeked of Voss's fingerprints. The courtroom was packed, locals cramming the pews, their eyes glinting with a mix of curiosity and venom, the gallery a buzzing hive of whispers. Jada's shoulder ached under its bandage, her forehead scab itching, but she kept her chin high, her gaze locked on the bench where Judge Clara Henshaw presided, a pinched woman with grey curls and a pinched frown, a temporary replacement while Voss was suspended. Jessa sat beside her, her braids frayed, her ribs still tender from the mob's boots, her face a mask of steel despite the exhaustion carving lines around her eyes. The prosecution, a slick attorney named Vernon Lyle with a greased comb-over, and a shark's grin strutted before the jury. 12 men and women handpicked by Voss's allies, their faces hard with bias. Lyle waved Jada's knife, its blade gleaming under the lights, and spun his tale. "These sisters torched their own farm," he declared, his voice smooth as oil. "Desperate for insurance money, they staged a fire, endangering Elwood with their reckless greed." Jada's fists clenched, her chains rattling, the lie so blatant it burned. She leaned to Jessa, whispering, "He's full of it." But Jessa's nod was tight, her eyes on Lyle as he called his star witness. Judge Raymond Voss strode in, his suspension sidelined but his swagger intact, his gaunt frame draped in a suit instead of a robe. The room hushed, reverence rippling through the crowd, and Jada's stomach twisted, her rage a live coal in her chest. Voss took the stand, his buzzard eyes glinting as he swore in, his voice a low drawl of authority. "I heard 'em bragging," he said, leaning into the mic. "Said they'd burn it down, cash out, and laugh at us all. Arrogant, the pair of 'em." Jada's jaw dropped, her chains clanking as she shot up, but Henshaw's gavel cracked, silencing her. "Sit," the judge snapped, her frown deepening, and Jada sank back, her pulse hammering. Jessa gripped her arm, her voice a hiss. "He's lying through his teeth." Lyle smirked, pacing before the jury, piling on Polk's evidence. The knife, the charred debris painting them as villains who'd betrayed their own land. Jada wanted to scream, to lunge across the room and choke the truth out of Voss. But the jury's nods, their tight lips, told her the fix was in. They had no lawyer, Tara's betrayal leaving them bare, and Henshaw denied their every objection. Her ruling's a rubber stamp for Lyle. Jessa took the stand, her voice steady despite the pain in her ribs, laying out the mob attack, the sniper, the explosion, pointing to Voss as the puppet master. "He's framing us," she said, her eyes sweeping the jury, "because we wouldn't bow." Lyle scoffed, cutting her off with sneers, and Voss's testimony drowned her out, his lies polished by years on the bench. The jury deliberated for 3 hours, a sham that felt like minutes, and returned with guilty verdicts, their voices flat, their eyes averted. Henshaw sentenced them to 20 years, her gavel a thunderclap, and Jada's world tilted, the room spinning as deputies hauled them up, the gallery's murmurs a dull roar in her ears. They were loaded into a prison transport van that evening, the sky a bruised purple over Elwood, the air heavy with the promise of rain. Jada sat chained to a bench, Jessa beside her, the van's interior a steel cage stinking of rust and despair. 2 guards up front, their radios crackling, ignored them, the road jolting under bald tires. Jada's mind raced. 20 years for a fire they didn't set, a sentence Voss had engineered from the shadows. She thought of their grandfather, his farm now a memory, and felt a hollow ache, her defiance fraying at the edges. Jessa leaned close, her voice a whisper over the engine's growl. "We'll fight this," she said, her breath warm against Jada's ear. "Appeals, feds, something." Jada nodded, clinging to that thread, thin as it was, when the van lurched, a deafening crash rocking the frame. Metal screamed as a truck rammed them from the side, the van flipping into a ditch, glass shattering, chains biting into Jada's wrists as she slammed against the wall. Her vision blurred, pain exploding in her shoulder, blood trickling from her nose as the world spun. Jessa groaned beside her, her head lolling, a gash on her temple. The guards were still, slumped in their seats, and Jada's heart slammed against her ribs as masked men pried the back doors open, their boots thudding on the twisted floor. 4 figures, bandanas tight over their faces, hauled them out. Jada's chains dragging as she stumbled into the ditch, the air thick with gasoline fumes. "Voss's orders," one growled, his voice a rasp, and Jada's blood chilled, her worst fear confirmed. They doused her with gas, the liquid cold and sharp, splashing Jessa beside her, the stench choking her lungs. Jada's mind flashed to Fort Bragg, survival drills in the rain, and she moved, instinct overriding pain. She kicked out, her boot, cracking a knee, the man howling as he dropped his can. Jessa lunged, her chained hands swinging, knocking a second off balance, gasoline sloshing across the dirt. A match flared, the flame dancing in the dark, and Jada tackled Jessa away, the fire catching with a whoosh behind them. Heat seared her back, the ditch erupting in orange, screams echoing as the men scattered, one sleeve ablaze. Jada broke, her chains against a jagged edge of the van, her wrists bleeding, and yanked Jessa free, their hands slick with gas and blood. They ran, stumbling through the brush, flames licking the night, the van a pyre in the distance. They collapsed a mile out, hidden in a thicket, thorns tearing at their skin, their breaths ragged gasps. Jada's shoulder screamed, her nose dripping. Red, but she checked Jessa, whose temple bled steadily, her eyes dazed but fierce. "Fugitives now," Jessa said, her voice a croak, and Jada nodded, wiping blood from her face. The trial had been a farce, the sentence a death warrant, and Voss had doubled down, sending killers to finish it. She thought of the mob, the sniper, each attack a step toward this, and felt a cold fury settle in her gut. They'd survived by seconds, their army grit pulling them through, but they were outlaws now, hunted in a town that wanted them dead. Jada gripped Jessa's hand, her voice low. "He won't stop," she said, and Jessa's nod was grim. "Neither will we." They lay low, the night wrapping around them, the distant wail of sirens, a mocking lullaby. Jada's mind churned, replaying the crash, the gas, the match. Voss's voice on the stand, a liar who'd turned justice into a noose. She thought of their grandfather's farm, lost to flames and lies, and felt a resolve harden, sharper than the pain. They'd been convicted, nearly burned alive, but they weren't broken, not yet. Jessa's breathing steadied beside her, her hand still in Jada's, and they waited. fugitives in the dark plotting their next move. Voss had pushed them to the edge, but edges were where rangers thrived, and he'd learned that soon enough. Jada Carter crouched in the swampy thicket, her boots sinking into the muck, the Georgia night alive with the croak of frogs and the sting of mosquitoes. It was 3 days after the prison van flipped, the gasoline-soaked ambush that nearly burned. Them alive, and now she and Jessa were fugitives, their faces plastered on wanted posters across Elwood. Jada's shoulder throbbed under its bandage, the sniper's graze festering in the damp, her nose still crusted with blood from the crash. Jessa knelt beside her, her temples gash scabbed over, her braids matted with mud, her ribs a dull ache as she breathed shallowly through the pain. They'd ditched their chains in the brush, their wrists raw and bleeding, and stolen clothes from a gas station dumpster, faded hoodies and jeans that hung loose but hid their identities. The swamp was their shield, a fetid maze of cypress and water where Polk's deputies wouldn't tread, but Jada knew they couldn't hide forever. Jessa pulled their burner phone from a plastic bag, its battery flickering at 10%, and dialed Mia Chen, their last lifeline. "We're alive," Jessa whispered, her voice hoarse, the signal crackling over the water's hum. Mia's reply was frantic. "Polk's saying you killed the guards in that crash. Feds are sniffing, but Voss is still free." Jada's jaw tightened, her fists clenching in the mud. Killed the guards? Another lie stacked on the arson frame-up, Voss's web spinning tighter. She thought of the explosion, the mob, each blow a hammer driving them deeper, and felt a cold fury ignite. "We've got one shot," she said, taking the phone. "Get us Voss's bank records, everything." Mia hesitated, then agreed, her voice firm. "I'll smuggle them to you. Stay low." They moved at dawn, slogging through the swamp to a derelict fishing shack Mia had pinpointed, its tin roof sagging, its walls rotting with mildew. The air stank of fish and decay, but it had a rickety table and a cracked window, enough to work. Mia arrived by noon, her hatchback rattling up a dirt trail, her wiry frame tense as she handed over a USB drive. "Hargrove Realty's payments," she said, her eyes darting to the trees. "Voss to Polk, Polk to the mob, it's all here." Jada plugged it into a scavenged laptop, its screen flickering as she hacked in, Army cyber training kicking in, her fingers flying over the keys. Jessa watched, her breath fogging the damp air as records spilled out, dates, amounts, coded names tying Voss to every attack, a blueprint of corruption. Jada's heart raced, the proof a loaded gun in their hands. "This ends him," she said, copying the files to the phone, her voice trembling with adrenaline. Jessa nodded, her eyes sharp despite the pain. "Feds need it," she said, dialing Tara's old contact, a federal agent named Ruiz, her voice clipped as she sent the data. Ruiz's reply was curt. "Solid, we're raiding Voss's place tonight." Jada felt a surge, a crack in the wall they'd been slamming against, but the swamp's stillness shattered as Mia's phone buzzed, a live feed from Voss's mansion popping up. He stood on his porch, mid-interview, his gaunt face sneering at a reporter. "Those Carters are criminals," he said, his voice a venomous drawl. "Justice'll catch 'em." Jada's blood boiled, her knuckles whitening when Ruiz's team swarmed in, cuffs snapping around Voss's wrists, his shouts cut off as they hauled him away. Jada grinned, a fierce slash across her battered face, but the victory was short-lived. Headlights pierced the dusk, 5 trucks roaring up the trail, Polk's kill squad spilling out, rifles glinting in the fading light. Jessa cursed, shoving Mia behind the shack as bullets tore through the walls, wood splintering around them. Jada dove for the table, grabbing gas cans she'd scavenged from a boat dock, her mind flashing to brag improvised traps in the field. "Cover me!" she yelled, and Jessa nodded, snatching a rusted machete from the floor, her ribs screaming, as she swung at a shadow lunging through the door. The blade bit flesh, a grunt echoing as the man fell, and Jada rigged the cans, splashing gas across the shack's frame, her hands slick with sweat and blood. She struck a match, the flame flaring bright, and tossed it, the gas igniting with a roar, a wall of fire exploding outward. The squad screamed, silhouettes staggering in the blaze, rifles dropping as flames licked their legs. Jada pulled Jessa, Back Mia scrambling beside them, the heat searing their backs as they ran, the shack collapsing in a storm of sparks. Polk emerged from the chaos, his khaki uniform singed, his face twisted with rage, blood streaming from a gash on his arm. He lunged at Jessa, his bulk crashing her into the mud, his hands clawing for her throat. Jada spun, her boot slamming, his ribs knocking him off, and grabbed his neck, twisting hard, a sickening snap ending his snarl. He went limp, his eyes wide in the firelight, and Jada staggered back, her hands shaking, Polk's blood staining her fingers. They stumbled clear, the squad survivors fleeing into the swamp, the flames a beacon in the dark. Jada's chest heaved, her shoulder pulsing, her breath ragged as she checked Jessa, whose neck bore red marks but whose eyes burned fierce. Mia clutched the phone, its screen cracked but alive, Ruiz's voice crackling through. "Voss is in custody, you're safe." Jada nodded, exhaustion crashing over her, the fight's end a hollow thud in her gut. They'd taken Polk down. He exposed Voss, but the cost was carved in their skin, their grandfather's farm a memory torched by hate. Jessa gripped her arm, steadying her, and they limped to the road, the swamp's edge glowing orange behind them. Sirens wailed, closing in, and Jada tensed, her pulse spiking as a helicopter's spotlight pinned them in its glare. The roar of blades drowning the night. Jada shielded her eyes, her mind racing. Polk's body cooling in the mud. Voss's arrest a distant echo. The light was blinding, the chopper low, and she braced for cuffs, for a new cage, her defiance flaring. One last time. Jessa stood beside her, her braids whipping in the wind, her face a mask of grit and pain, and Jada felt the bond that had carried them through, stronger than the steel that failed to hold them. They'd fought a war, toppled a tyrant, but this moment teetered, a cliff's edge they couldn't see past. The spotlight held them, the sirens screamed closer, and Jada's breath caught, her hand finding Jessa's, waiting for the fall or the flight, whichever came first. Jessa Carter stood rooted in the swamp's edge, the helicopter's spotlight blinding her, its roar a thunderclap over the Georgia night. Mud caked her boots, her ribs throbbed from Polk's chokehold, and her braids whipped in the choppers. Downdraft, stinging her bruised face. Jada gripped her hand, her shoulder bleeding through its bandage, her breath ragged from snapping Polk's neck minutes ago in the shack's fiery collapse. The kill squad's remnants had fled, their trucks swallowed by the dark, and Voss was in cuffs, hauled off by feds after their evidence drop. Jessa's heart pounded, the spotlight a judge's glare. Her mind braced for deputies to swarm to drag them back to a cell for Polk's death, fugitives branded forever. She squeezed Jada's hand, her voice lost in the noise, but her eyes said it. They'd fought to the end, no regrets. The chopper hovered, blades slicing the air, and Jessa waited for the fall, her legs trembling but her spine steel. The craft descended, landing 50 feet away, its skids sinking into the muck, the spotlight dimming as the engines whined down. Jessa squinted, her pulse spiking as figures emerged. Not sheriff's deputies in khaki, but men in crisp uniforms, insignias glinting on their chests. 3 strode forward, led by a broad-shouldered man with a grey buzz cut, and a colonel's. Stars, his face weathered but stern. Jada tensed beside her, her grip tightening, and Jessa's breath caught as he stopped, his boots squelching, and snapped a salute. "Sergeant Carter," he barked, his voice cutting through the fading roar. "Colonel James Tate, Fort Bragg. Stand at ease." Jessa blinked, disbelief washing over her, her legs nearly buckling as Jada's jaw dropped, the salute a jolt to their battered nerves. Army brass? Here? Tate lowered his hand, his eyes sweeping their mud-streaked forms, the blood, the bruises, a flicker of respect in his gaze. "We've been tracking this," he said, his tone clipped but warm. "Voss's threats hit Pentagon radar after your blogger pinged us. Harassing Ranger grads is a line he shouldn't have crossed." Jessa's mind spun, Mia's posts, the online storm. It had reached beyond Elwood, beyond Voss's grasp. Tate gestured to his men, who fanned out, securing the perimeter, their rifles ready but not aimed. "Feds cleared you," he said, pulling a tablet from his pack, its screen glowing with orders. "Polk's death, self-defense, Voss's racketeering, your evidence sealed it. You're free." Jada exhaled, a shaky laugh breaking through, her hand slipping from Jessa's to clutch her chest, relief flooding her battered frame. Jessa's knees wobbled, the weight of weeks, months, lifting in a rush, but Tate's next words hit like a punch. "There's more," he said, his voice dropping, serious now. "The farm's gone, Pentagon's seizing it, national security training site, effective immediately. Your actions here, exposing corruption, surviving this hell, it's a case. Study now." Jessa's stomach plummeted, her breath freezing. The farm, their grandfather's blood-soaked acres, stripped away again. Jaida's face darkened, her fists clenching, but Tate raised a hand. "You're not walking away empty," he said, pulling 2 medals from his pocket, ranger stars glinting in the moonlight. "For valor, under fire. And a new mission, training recruits at Bragg. You're legends now." He pinned the medals to their torn hoodies, his grip firm, and Jessa felt the cold metal a bittersweet weight against her heart. They stood silent, the swamp's hum filling the void, Jada's eyes glistening as she traced the star, her voice a whisper. "We lost it," she said, and Jessa nodded, her throat tight, the farm's fields flashing in her mind, now ash and memory. Tate's men loaded Polk's body into the chopper, the kill squad's wreckage smoldering in the distance, and Jessa thought of Voss caged at last, his empire dust. The feds had swept his mansion, found a smuggled note in his cell that morning. "Rangers never lose," slipped through bars by an unknown hand. He'd choked on it, literally, his autopsy a footnote in the chaos, a karmic twist Jada would have savored if the farm still stood. Jessa's ribs ached, her temple pulsed, but she straightened, the medal a tether to something bigger, a legacy forged in fire. The chopper lifted them out, Elwood shrinking below, its lights a scattered glow against the dark. Jada leaned against her, her shoulder warm despite the blood, and Jessa stared out, the swamp fading, the farm a scar on the horizon. They landed. At Bragg by dawn, the base a sprawl of barracks and ranges, familiar ground that smelled of gunpowder and sweat. Tate briefed them, his voice crisp, assigning them to train recruits, their story a lesson in grit and justice. Jessa walked the halls, her boots echoing, Jada beside her, their medals catching the light, and felt a strange peace settle, a purpose born from loss. They'd lost the land, but gained a fight that echoed beyond Elwood, a tale recruits would whisper, a warning to tyrants like Voss. Months later, Jessa stood on a training field, the sun blazing, barking orders at a line of recruits, their faces young and eager, Jada pacing the flank, her voice sharp with command. The farm was a fenced-off zone now, its clay churned by drills, its barn a memory replaced by bunkers, but Jessa saw their grandfather in every stride, his quiet strength in their own. She thought of Voss's end, Polk's snap, the battles that carved them into this, and felt the medal under her shirt, a badge of survival. Jada caught her eye, a nod passing between them, and Jessa knew they'd won something Voss couldn't touch, a legacy not of dirt, but of defiance, etched in the recruits who'd carry it forward. The saga of Jada and Jessa Carter offers raw, unflinching lessons about resilience, justice, and the cost of standing tall against systemic hate. First, it shows that courage isn't just facing bullets or bombs, but enduring relentless prejudice, with grit and cunning, as the twins did against Judge Voss's tyranny. Their Army Ranger training wasn't just physical, it forged a mental steel that turned every setback, arson, betrayal, a rigged trial, into fuel for their fight. Second, it reveals the power of truth, even when buried under lies. Their evidence, hard-won and smuggled out, toppled a corrupt empire, proving that persistence can crack even the toughest walls. Third, it underscores the bitter reality of sacrifice. They lost their grandfather's farm, a piece of their soul, to gain a broader victory, teaching that justice often demands a steep price. Finally, it highlights community, however small, Mia's blogging, Eli's fleeting aid, showing that allies, even flawed ones, can tip the scales when the odds seem impossible. This story isn't just about surviving a racist judge, it's a mirror to our world, asking us to confront power's ugly face and our own resolve. The twins didn't win the land, but they reclaimed their dignity, a triumph Voss couldn't steal. So, what's the takeaway? Fight for what's right, even when it costs everything. Because the echo of that stand outlasts the dirt you lose. What do you think? Would you risk it all like Jada and Jessa to take down a giant like Voss? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Hit that like button if their grit inspires you. And subscribe for more tales of justice against the odds. Share this if you believe truth can still win. Thanks for joining this wild ride. Here's to strength and hope in your own battles.